Bergson holographic theory. This is part 42, and it's going to be just redone. So if you've seen it, what I'm adding is slides 43 through 47, which is on Bergson's own form of panpsychism. This is Panpsychism Arising, Phil Goff's version, which is a Russellian Monism, intrinsic consciousness everywhere, and of course the ever-present conscious particles. And we'll see the growing reaction this is to physicalism, but it's a form of desperation in the air, with still no grasp of their metaphysic or of time, and of course, no grasp of the unique panpsychism Bergson presented. So there seems a production line of consciousness theories. All, of course, represent some new attack on the hard problem. Some are, it is said, causing new waves in the theory world. None ask, how does this theory explain the image of the external world, the humble coffee cup being stirred? If asked, they collapse. None can spell time. None think how or whether the brain stores experience is even a problem. None think Bergson existed or worthy of an erg of attention. So we come to yet another. Panpsychism is, of course, not new. It has already had its exponents in and before this debate. Whitehead, Scribina, of course, in his history, so to speak, of panpsychism in the West, Strawson. I've explained that Bergson's theory is panpsychic, but a unique version thereof, with considerations so far beyond these guys as to make them look, well, like kindergartners, but Bergson does not exist to these guys. So a new exponent has caught my attention, Phil Goff. Lots of YouTube talks, one book, one coming, his hero, Bertrand Russell, and Russellian Monism. His latest book, Galileo's Heir. As with the idealist, Hoffman, Castrop, which we talked about in 38 and 41, this is a reaction and growing to what they define very inadequately as physicalism. That is, kind of the world as featureless particle billiard balls. Bergson is way beyond them in 1889. Phil's starting point is in Galileo. To quote, and I'm quoting from this talk of his on Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, 2018. Before Galileo, he says, people thought the world was filled with sensory qualities. The spiciness of the paprika is really in the paprika. The smell of the flowers is really in the flowers. Colors are really in the surfaces of objects. But he says the problem is, it's hard to see how you can capture these kinds of qualities in the purely quantitative language of mathematics. How you capture in an equation what it's like to taste paprika or see red. Very good point. So, Galileo answered this challenge with a philosophical theory, Phil says, a reimagining of the universe. According to his reimagining, the sensory qualities are not really out there in the world. They're just in the soul of the perceiver. So the qualities of that table, brown, smooth, etc., are in the soul of our guy there. So he goes on. So the crucial point is that Galileo at least never intended physical science to be a complete picture of reality. He thought it could describe the mathematical qualities of the physical world, but not the sensory qualities, which he took to be forms of consciousness. Again, a great point. And again, we're noting Galileo there, the table, we can describe the mathematical quantities of the table, its length, etc. And for Galileo, that the fact that it's square. And these would be considered primary properties, objective. But these other things, in the guy's mind, they're secondary properties. So secondary properties in the soul of the receiver. Primary properties on the right, they're in the parts of the table. Size, length, breadth, width, form, mass. And these primary properties can be captured in the purely quantitative language of mathematics. The moral, physical science has done incredibly since Galileo set the rules. This does not imply physical science can handle qualities. In fact, Galileo, should he return, would say, of course science can't explain qualia. It was never intended to. Now, a quick comment. Even should we accept this distinction, primary versus secondary properties, and many theorists still would, it doesn't work. Perceived form is dynamic. It's not computable. It's probabilistic. It's an optimal specification. We discussed, for example, the strobed rotating wire edge cube. Strobed in phase with a symmetry period, it's a nice rigid cube. Strobed out of phase, it becomes a wobbly, plastically deforming, well, not a cube. Or the rotating ellipse. Rotating too fast, it loses its rigidity. So form or shape is equally qualia. Dynamic form is equally qualia. Again, take the rotating Gibsonian cube with flow fields. As it rotates towards us, an expanding flow field. As it rotates away, a contracting flow field. Again, we've got invariance over time of continuous flow. In this Gibsonian cube, the edges, the vertices are simply sharp discontinuities at the junctures of these flows. They're invariance, so to speak, but only over the dynamic flow. So again, we've got here sort of the time problem recognition failure I've talked about, where we simply do not bring in the problem of time. So forms fill the image of the external world. That's why the whole image must be accounted for. Our little kitchen there has got tons of forms, but they're all dynamic forms in reality. You can't compute the forms in the image and then just have to worry about qualia. The whole image is the problem. So Berkeley noted that Locke's distinction of primary versus secondary was not comprehensible, not coherent. What is a form without color? Nonsensical. I mean, you can't compute, or can you compute the form of a gray cube, but not a red, blue, or green cube? It's incoherent. But partly why the hard problem is misstated and not understood. That is, the hard problem is in reality explaining the image of the external world. Philip now introduces Eddington and Russell. Their starting point is, physical science tells you a lot less than you think about the nature of matter. But Russell and Eddington realizes that due to the nature of mathematics, science cannot tell us what physical properties are. The mathematical characterization of physical properties is circular. Take the simple F equal ma as opposed to the equation Phil's got on the board there. Or, well, A is defined as F over M, and M is defined as F over A, completely circular, all defined in terms of each other. Physics, he says, is just not in the business of telling us what physical properties are. It just assumes them and tells us mathematical relationships between them. For Eddington, physics is a tool for prediction. So all the successful predictions look great, a tremendous aura of knowledge, says Phil, and yet it is doing great precisely because it is ignoring what everything is. Good point. In other words, physics is only in the business of discovering invariance laws. F equal ma is an invariance law. It's amazing how little this is understood. Now, I noted in number 9 in free will, Bergson had already been here in 1889 with F equal ma, discussing the concept of force and the physicist's notion thereof. He had noted that the physicist is careful to express this only as a relation among magnitudes. That is, it's an invariance law. This was his context of the origin of force as a cause, as a derivative from our psychological experiential being. And I should say even that is, he pointed out, is a misappropriation of our psychological experience. That is, force is a phenomenon of a physical, psychical universal field, but physics does not touch this. That is, it's already where Goff is going to go. This will relate to a larger context later. We see Philip using the gravitational equation for force in his example of circularity, the lack of definition of properties. Let's drive this in with a quote from Newton on this. He was hardly unaware of the problem. To quote, "It is inconceivable that inanimate brute matter should, without the mediation of something else, which is not material, operate upon and affect other matter without mutual contact, as it must do if gravitation, in the sense of Epicurus, be essential and inherent in it. And this is one reason why I desired you would not ascribe innate gravity to me, that gravity should be innate, inherent, and essential to matter, so that one body may act upon another at a distance through a vacuum without the mediation of anything else, by and through which their action and force can be conveyed from one to another, is to me so great an absurdity that I believe no man who has in philosophical matters a competent faculty of thinking can ever fall into it. Gravity must be caused by an agent acting constantly according to certain laws, but whether this agent be material or immaterial, I have left to the consideration of my readers." So this is Newton to Bentley. Yes, mutual contact. Thus, a glimpse of why I tend to veer away from current physics in an attempt to further develop Bergson towards theorists like Wheeler and Dollard and the numbers discussed there, with intrinsic roots in Heaviside, Thompson, Steinmetz, where we see what it looks like to actually try to understand these properties, quote unquote. Okay, this is essentially the end of Phil's expression of the current attack on and distaste for physicalism. But before he gets to panpsychism, ask, what have we not seen? What have we not seen? Well, we've seen no real understanding of the classic metaphysic, the metaphysic at the base of all this, particularly a complete unawareness of the problem of time. Bergson was aware of this entire problem. His basis for reaction, expressed in 1889 in Time and Free Will, was Herbert Spencer. Spencer had codified the classic metaphysic, underlying science, the big thing of the day. And so was Spencer. You see his Synthetic Philosophy, 10 volumes. To Spencer, time was to be treated as if it were a little different from space. Like space, time is measurable and contains juxtaposed parts. Like space, it is a homogeneous medium whose parts and properties are everywhere alike. So we're kind of looking at my little favorite picture, where time is simply a series of instants of space, where each space has the time extent of a mathematical point. And of course then, each cube then of space, shall we say, is utterly homogeneous, because when you have the time extent of a mathematical point, there can be no qualities. And so we have cube after cube after cube of space, all along a fourth dimension called time. So like space then, it is capable of being measured by mathematical concepts. And one can say that one time is equal to another, or twice as long as another. Or in other words, space 1 and space 2 are twice as long as space 3, or twice as big, or twice as long in terms of duration. And finally, it is meaningful to say time is composed of instants. The movement of time is a series of instants. As a body moves from point to point in space across that abstract continuum of points and positions, well, time becomes just another dimension of the abstract space. So to his surprise, Bergson found that this common sense and well-accepted view had held little validity. The most cursory examination revealed that moments of time are not alike, that each has its own quality, nor do instants ever simply repeat, like our cubes, or simply occur in succession. Rather, there is a continuous flow for each moment merged into the next. And thus, as we have seen, Bergson was to describe a far different time as lived by the self, a time he termed duration. To quote from Time and Free Will, below homogeneous, that is abstract time, which is the spatial symbol of true duration, a close psychological analysis distinguishes a duration whose heterogeneous moments permeate one another, below the numerical multiplicity of conscious states, the self in which succeeding each other means melting into one another and forming an organic whole. So it's like a melody, where each note permeates the next. Physical time, as described by Spencer, could only be the limiting case of this real time. But such a time until the rejection of Spencer's mechanism. Now for mechanism, read physicalism. Same difference. If mechanism was correct, all change is reducible to the completely predictable motions of material particles, and free will is an illusion, just billiard balls in the brain. But the experience of duration showed that change was far more dynamic, organic, and interrelated as a process than could be supported by the motions of particles. The present could not repeat the past. Each present moment was poised before novel possibilities. Mechanism, again, physicalism, was wrong, both in its account of change and its assumption of simple prediction. But where is any of this in Phil? Still, after 130 years, I'm not blaming Phil so much as his mentors, such as Russell. But where is this in Phil? A symptom. All its qualities are static. The taste of paprika, the smell of coffee, the color red. There are none of the dynamic, time-flowing qualities that Hardcastle described, Valerie Hardcastle. Quote, the audience shifting in their seats, the musicians concentrating, the curtains ever so gently waving. Or make the rose blooming, the coffee stirring. Now in the dynamic, in time, but time is not mentioned. There will be no progress until spatialized time, the true problem of the classic metaphysic, is grasped. For Phil, there's a gap in physics. We don't actually know what physical properties are. It's a problem of intrinsic natures. We know how an electron behaves, but what is it? And how does it relate to consciousness? If a gap in physics, then there is one in neuroscience. Properties of the brain in terms of chemistry, or taken in terms of chemistry, but chemistry does in terms of physics. And we're right back to the, in a circular, we're back to the problem of physics. But in other words, back to the problem. We don't know what brain states truly are. So he says, so we have this huge gap in our understanding of the brain. Eddington's insight is, we have this gap, and we're looking for a place for consciousness. Let's fill the gap with consciousness. So we hit Russellian monism. Conscious states are the real nature of brain states, he says. We have C fibers, one fires, given a pin, we have a pain. And feeling a pain is the real nature of the C firing. This was the genius of Russell and Eddington. They combined the problem of consciousness with the problem of intrinsic natures. So physics tells how particles behave, but in their intrinsic nature, they are unimaginably simple forms of consciousness. This essentially solves the problem of consciousness by finding there's a place for consciousness in the workings of the physical world. Now, is this genius? Well, we'll see. There are two fixations here, the particles and the brain. Let's start on the particles. The particles, little billiard balls, are considered to be conscious. We're still stuck in the classic metaphysic. For Bergson, objects and their motions. This was a fundamental partition in the universal holographic field by our perception. for the sake of action by the body, to grab a bottle, to shake or rattle. Rather, he said, the field as a whole is changing, like a kaleidoscope. That is, objects and their motions are changes or transfers of state within the global motion of the whole. What is a particle, he said, but the extension and thought of this bodily perceptual process, by which useful objects were first identified in the whole. It is a concept derived purely for practical action, which will never, imported into the realm of pure knowledge, explain the properties of matter. He goes on, but the materiality of the atom dissolves more and more under the eyes of the physicists. We have no reason, for instance, for representing the atom to ourselves as a solid rather than as a liquid or gaseous, nor for picturing the reciprocal action of atoms by shocks rather than by any other way. Why do you think of a solid atom and why of shocks? Because solids, being the bodies in which we have clearly the most hold, are those which interest us most in our relations with the external world. Between these particles, we envision forces of attraction, ultimately even a gravitational effect between all objects of the universe. Something then exists between the atoms. It will be said that this something is no longer matter but force, and we shall be asked to picture to ourselves, stretched between the atoms, threads which will be made more and more tenuous until they are invisible and even, we are told, immaterial. But what purpose can this crude image serve? And he says, but what happens to this image? And indeed, we see force and matter drawing nearer together the more deeply the physical physicist has penetrated into their effects. We see force more and more materialized, the atom more and more idealized, the two terms converging towards a common limit, and thus the universe recovering its continuity. The Russellian monist hasn't gotten here yet. It's only been 120 years. For Phil, the particles are conscious. A mass of them comprise the brain. So now we can understand brain states. That is, we'll focus on brain states to understand phenomenal experience, the coffee being stirred. But we, that is Phil, just got done destroying Galileo, his primary and secondary properties distinction. This distinction no longer applies to the entire material world, not only to brains. The entire universal field is qualitative. It has both primary and secondary properties. These cannot be logically, coherently separated. Roses, tables, coffee cups, qualitative within the field. So why have you fixed on the brain and trying to figure out via some form of emergence, as we shall see, how the brain, with its mass of conscious particles, generates an image of the coffee stirring? Why not this focus? How does the brain specify an image of qualitative aspects of the already qualitative external field, right where they say they are, within the field? This was Bergson's question, the significance of matter and memories, chapter 1, and Gibson's question 2. Why not? Because in reality, they are still stuck in the featureless billiard ball particles that happen to be conscious. Let's go to one cause thereof. So, Russell. Sorry, he's not that impressive and carries this, the DNA of blindness on time. Russell happened to be one of Bergson's greatest critics. He sought to recast Zeno's arguments into an arithmetical framework, but Russell's solutions to these paradoxes are most curious. To begin with, Russell, probably to Zeno's amazement, agrees on the facts of the arrow paradox. Remember the arrow paradox. The arrow is always coincident with its static point. It never moves. That is, it's coincident with a static point in that abstract continuum of points and positions of the classic metaphysic. So he says, after 2,000 years of continual refutation. These sophisms were reinstated and made the foundation of a mathematical renaissance by a German professor who probably never dreamed of any connection between himself and Zeno. Weierstrass, by strictly banishing infinitesimals, has at last shown that we live in an unchanging world, and that the arrow, at every moment of its flight, is truly at rest. The only point where Zeno probably erred was in inferring, if he did infer, that because there is no change, therefore the world must be in the same state at one time as at another. This consequence by no means follows. How an unchanging world can be different at successive moments, Russell does not explain. This, again, is the instantaneous cubes of all of space model of the transformation of the universal field, where there's ever only one cube, where each has the time extent of a mathematical point, where each is frozen. There is no way to explain the transition to the next changed cube, other than by invoking a god. That is, we're assuming a background continuous process, implicitly regenerating the entire universe, cube after cube after cube, with each cube being a slight change from the previous somehow. In other words, a recreation of the universe, instant after instant, cube after cube. This is where Descartes was driven, as Bergson noticed. That is invoking God to explain change in this, in reality, timeless, classic metaphysic cosmology. At its essence is the assumption Zeno relies upon, that time is just another form of space. Somewhere, critiquing Bergson's motion as indivisible, Russell states there can be a staccato process. Right, that's a staccato process. The only problem is that implicitly it requires, well, shall we say this, a god to keep things moving. Russell proceeds to resolve each paradox. Zeno's fourth paradox, absolutely untouched. In this paradox, the fourth, Zeno asks us to imagine a body A moving at a certain speed. It passes two other bodies, one at rest and the body B moving at a certain speed. B in the middle moving at a certain speed. It passes two other bodies, one at rest, A, the one at rest, and one moving towards it at the same speed, C. As such, at the end of instant. During the same time, the duration that B passes a certain length of the resting body A, it passes double the same length of the body C moving towards it. And Zeno concludes that a duration is a double of itself. Russell's solution is to agree that this has its exact analog in an arithmetic paradox that he has developed. As far as the time aspect of Zeno's argument, Russell states, the best we can say is that at one instant the bodies were in one alignment, and the next they were in another, and that we cannot say what happened in between. In other words, we're back to this. That is, the transition from cube to cube that we need a god to explain. That is, he accepts the paradox as valid. In point of fact, Russell left the core of Zeno's conundrums untouched, strewing problematic statements about time along the way. He was to further backtrack and alter opinions in 1911. It is an unfortunate fact that Bergson's resolution has been in the meantime neglected. It was held consistently throughout his works. The paradoxes arise from the false assumption that motion and time are divisible in infinitum. This assumption is based on the confusion of the movement itself, with its motionless track in space. It is this track, or trajectory, that is infinitely divisible to little points. An infinitely divisible line, a space of points. At bottom, the illusion arises from this, says Bergson, that the movement once effected has laid along its course a motionless trajectory on which we can count as many immobilities, that is static points, as we will. From this we conclude that the movement, while being effected, lays at each instant beneath it a position with which it coincides. We do not see that the trajectory is created in one stroke, though a certain time is required for it. and that though we can divide at will the trajectory once created, we cannot divide its creation, which is an act in progress and not a thing. It is the trajectory that Zeno contemplates in the fourth paradox, totally consistent with his assumption and of the same fabric with the other paradoxes, when he declares a duration the double of itself. I've discussed the invalidity of the so-called mathematical resolutions in video number 3, and in that little book there. It is the trajectory of Achilles we can divide, but not his motion. Each of his steps must be construed as indivisible, and so must those of the tortoise. They are not decomposable at will. The movement of the arrow is undivided, an undivided fact. It never rests at some point along the way. Time, the very motion of the universal field, is not space. This simple statement makes all the difference, but it is a difference that has utterly escaped Phil and the panpsychic theorist. So, continuing with the Russell. As I said, the first slide, I thought Phil had inherited some bad DNA. Bergson spoke of the universe as the aggregate of images. Chapter 1, Matter and Memory. For we all know, or all we know, is the image of a thing, a tree, a butterfly, a cup, even atoms, not the thing in itself. Somewhat like Hoffman's icons, like the wastebasket, the trash can icon, which hides beneath it a whole reality of code. So beneath any of those images, the butterflies, another whole reality of atoms or whatever. For Bergson, this image mode was one mode of describing the material world. The skeptic of Bergson would say, well, what does he mean by an image? Surely this is some idealistic view. Like Sartre, the skeptic has failed to see Bergson's other mode, the holographic mode, as we discussed on Sartre, number 12. Bergson saw the matter field as a holographic field, 50 years before Gabor. His phrase, the photograph, is already developed in the very heart of things and at every point of space. The photograph is not in the brain. It's already in the universal field as an aspect of the field that is holographic. And this is a whole transforming indivisibly. So upgrading Bergson, in the holographic model, the brain becomes a modulated reconstructive wave passing through the holographic field, just like in the little blue box. The reconstructive wave step passes through the hologram, and they're specified to the viewer a virtual image, an object wave of the information, a set of the information recorded on that plate, which looks nothing like the cube being specified. So the brain is a reconstructive wave passing through the holographic field, is specific to a part of the field by this process, now an image, and at a scale of time. That is, a buzzing fly, for example, of our normal mode, as opposed to what could have been at a different scale of time specification, a heron-like fly barely folding his wings, flapping his wings. So with respect to images, Russell falls into the same trap. He calls this Bergson's, quote, very unfortunate debt to idealism. His evaluation of Bergson's philosophy begins and ends with this commitment of Bergson to the idealist camp. Wrong, a total fail. And by the way, that image, the fly, the coffee cup, is in the field, precisely where it says it is, not in the brain or just in the mind. So Bergson was not in idealism. He sought an intermediate place between realism and idealism, where properties, qualities, perception itself are just not in the mind, where idealism and Berkeley assigned them, but in the things, that is, within the holographic field. And as opposed to realism, the matter field is indeed qualitative. It's not a pile of featureless balls. from which it is impossible to restore or derive quality. The nature of the indivisible flow of time allows for qualities of motion, as well as, well, all qualities are qualities of motion. They include colors and sound. So, nevertheless, there are the things out there external in the field. But all this depends on time as an indivisible motion, on the holographic field as transforming indivisibly, as I noted, on his resolution of Zeno, all of which is beyond Russell and still beyond his descendants. Continuing a bit, in the burial of Bergson, Russell was one of the figures. We've seen Sartre, even Heidegger, as just a couple of others. There was a piece of background with the time, something to be considered. Bergson was enormously popular. Women flocked to hear him. French papers debated if he should move his lectures to the Paris Opera Hall. He was that popular. The popularity engendered academic envy, a backlash. This did not help the state of mind required to penetrate his extremely profound prescient vision. They criticized Bergson's use of metaphor, yet we have seen that all thought is based on analogy and metaphor. See Hofstadter and Sanders' mockery of academics who, using metaphor, profusely critique the use of metaphor. So, the panpsychic move, there's levels. Microphysics. On the micro level, physics, particles characterized as behavior, mass, charge, but intrinsically simple forms of consciousness. There's a chemical level, compounds characterized in terms of behavior, but intrinsically conscious. And the neural level, neuroscience, brain states in terms of behavior, but complex forms of consciousness. This leads to panpsychism. So Philip now addresses the combination problem. First, reductionist panpsychism. By the way, the combination problem, how from a bunch of little conscious billiard balls do you get the experience of the coffee stirring and the spoon and the swirling liquid, etc.? How do you combine billiard balls, little featureless billiard balls with consciousness into that qualitative experience over time? Minor problem. So in the solution to this combination problem, Phil tries or looks at a few things. First, reductionist panpsychism. This tries to explain human and animal consciousness in terms of particle consciousness. It's something like how the chemist explains the properties of water in terms of H2O molecules. Knowing H2O, we get completely satisfying explanation as to how and why water boils. Okay. Physicalism, to explain qualities, he says it's intractable. Reductionist panpsychism is tractable, but may take decades, centuries. But does the reductionist program ever even explain water? Search the question, what is the difference between water and H2O? The first answer that comes up via Quora is this. The idea that water simply is H2O is one of those false reductions that people can't seem to get out of their heads. What is actually true is that if you break apart the bonds in water, you'll get a ratio of hydrogen to oxygen that's roughly 2 to 1. A very large amount of this will be from H2O, some from OH, some from H3O, etc. And it is the overall interaction of all these, not just properties peculiar to H2O, that give us what we call water. Because the properties of water arise not from the molecule, but from constant, widespread dissolutions and reformations of H2O and related molecules. But this is a non-answer and typical. If you can figure out how water is wet from that, let me know. Does the appeal to widespread dissolutions and reformations actually explain the H2O to water transformation? Well, the rat says maybe we should have asked Feynman, if you remember Feynman's attempt to explain the nature of ice, or nature of magnetism via a analogy to ice. It was pretty much a fail. So just saying, mythology warning. Sort of the same case, trying to derive qualities from billiard balls. Well, in essence, it's the hard problem of physics. So, emergent panpsychism. This is Phil's favorite, kind of. Almost all theories of consciousness have a serious problem at their core. One theory doesn't. Emergentist panpsychism. This posits fundamental laws of nature to bridge the gap from particle consciousness to systems level consciousness. They hold that when you have conscious particles arranged in a certain kind of system, the system as a whole becomes conscious. That's just a basic fact about our universe in this proposal. Okay? Because they appeal to fundamental laws, the emergent panpsychist doesn't have a gap to bridge. So we just kind of blow up the gap there between brain consciousness and particle consciousness. They don't have to explain how we get from particle consciousness to brain consciousness. Why not? Because fundamental laws, by definition, cannot be explained. But we just said there's a bridge to gap, but now there's no bridge. Well, we won't get too involved in that. Now, the emergent panpsychist just has to get on with the empirical task of working out what these laws are. This is being done by Hedda Hasselmark, who worked with Tononi on IT, Integrated Information Theory, which we discussed in 35. Consciousness is correlated with maximum integrated information, his phi number. We had a phi there equivalent to a sponge because we're dealing with SpongeBob's consciousness, but that would be a more complex number derived from the interaction of, shall we say, all these nodes. Tononi's view is a correlation view, that consciousness is correlated with maximum information. What Mark does is take IIT and combine it with emergentist panpsychism. The result is a fundamental law of nature that in any system there is consciousness at the level in which there is most integrated information. But we noted in 34, actually 35, this is not a solution to the origin. IT is not a solution to the origin of the image of the external world. This is still just all neural activity. And it ignores the invariant structure of events. All those nice invariance laws defining coffee stirring, velocity flow fields, adiabatic ratios, inertial tensors, haptic flow field, acoustical invariance, texture, radiance ratios, and flows. Notice they're trying to break the event down into static properties that are, as we noted, in principally, not even, there's no in principle definition way of even doing this. They just sort of intuitively take a shot at breaking down this event on the table with their little bubbles there. And it is an image, a pile of neurons giving birth to an image, the coffee cup. The two things are the same order. That can't happen. Yes, we're back to the discussion of images in Matter and Memory, Chapter 1, that Russell failed. I noted that Tononi and IT is an emergence theory. In a video by Michael Silverstein, he noted panpsychism needs emergence theory, and emergence theory needs panpsychism. Why? Because physicalism needs the little thingies from which the consciousness emerges to be, intrinsically conscious. And panpsychism needs emergence from the massive little conscious thingies. And no one knows what proto-conscious thingies actually means in the first place. So what Silverstein calls the master argument is going on here is physicalism can't solve the hard problem. Emergence plus panpsychism seems to be the next most conservative alternative. So the panpsychic emergentist folks say they've solved the hard problem. Nope, not even close to addressing the origin of the image of the external world. I'm going to recap this statement once more. The image of the external world, as I just got a comment on number 41 from, I suspect, an academic with this effect. To quote, "How can you say that the hard problem is the origin of the image of the external world? That's not the hard problem. Here, look at Wiki. It's a peer-reviewed academic source." And you look at Wiki, and of course it says, the hard problem is all about explaining qualia, how experience has of what it is like. That's the favorite, what it is like. Why, accounting for the image, that would be easy. So, standard misconception. What it is like. Right. Yes, stirring the coffee is filled with qualia. Browns, creams, clinks, aroma. It is also filled with forms, spoons, cups, tables, hands. The forms, as we discussed, are not computable. They're equally qualia. Further, the event is time extended. It is a continuous flow. We see the stirring, the swirling. These are qualia defined over time, like hardcastles gently weaving curtains or patrons shifting in their seats. So this too must be explained, the time extent, and this ties to the profound problem of the nature of time. So the entire image of the external world must be explained. The forms which fully populated, its dynamic time extent, not just its qualia, as this term is currently narrowly, timelessly understood. This is to say, this is already the more complete, the more full statement of the hard problem. But there's more. Once it is realized that it's the image of the external world that must be accounted for, the problem of subject and object is naturally, intrinsically entailed. You cannot have a little homunculus inside the brain viewing the image, either outside or inside the brain for that matter. That is, that this is not understood is given away by this. No hard problem theorist I can think of treats the problem of subject and object, certainly not Chalmers. To state the problem correctly is to see its solution. Because guys create philosophy entries on Wiki does not mean they see the problem correctly. The theoretical performance on the hard problem to date should be sufficient evidence that it's not understood. Now, let me add again on that hard problem being the explaining of what it's like. Yes, there's an affect/feeling part of the experience. Yum, for example. The coffee looks delicious. Feeling aspect of the experience of the coffee being stirred. Affect falls naturally into Bergson's framework, but it's explaining the origin of the external image that has the priority as a problem. So let us look at the solution, Bergson's unique panpsychism. We noted that he saw the holographic field, or the matter field, the material field, as holographic. The photograph already develops in the very heart of things at all points of space. And the dynamic transformation of this holographic field over time is indivisible. Each instant interpenetrates, permeates the next as the notes of a melody. Each note or instant reflects the entire preceding series of notes, an organic continuity. There's a deep implication in this. If the state of each point/event in the field reflects the influences of the whole, in fact, the history of the whole, then in effect each point at the null scale of time, that is the most infinitely smallest scale, has an elementary awareness of the whole. It's as though stretched across the universal matter field is a vast, vibrant web of awareness. It is a highly coherent web, like the thread-like fibers are taut. A light flick with a finger sends reverberations instantly throughout the whole. This web, with its basic elemental awareness, A, and B, its fundamental primary memory as the web transforms indivisibly over time, carries then the elementary attributes of mind. Bergson called this pure perception. And the question became in his mind, in his statement, how perception is limited, not how it arises. This is a unique panpsychism. We do not need tiny proto-conscious particles here, where the consciousness of each is somehow, in some mysterious, inexplicable way, aggregated or combined together to form a larger consciousness, that is, to form our experience, stirring coffee, that is, our image of the external world. The brain, as a reconstructive wave, is specifying a part of this qualitative field. By that specification process, now an image, the coffee stirring, the buzzing fly, and at a scale of time. And when I say it's specifying a part of a qualitative field, the indivisible flow, the indivisible transformation of that field, where each instant is permeating the next, as an organic continuity, this supports qualities of motion, ever so gently waving curtains, buzzing flies, rotating cubes. Color itself is a vibrating field, a motion, and color, one can show, is an optimal specification of these vibrating fields. Discussed that more thoroughly in number 66. The selection principle from this vast qualitative field, and the information in that holographic field, is the relation to the possible action of the body. It has to have some relation to bodily action. Perception then becomes the display in reality of how we can act, or as Bergson succinctly put it, perception is virtual action. This actually becomes quite interesting when we look at scales of time. But this is the resolution to the aggregation problem, this model. But there is another resolution needed, the relation of subject and object. We must remove the homunculus, the little man, or in the holographic framework, the viewer. So the elementary awareness described is at the null scale of time, the smallest imaginable scale, not the scale of buzzing flies, stirring spoons, or falling leaves. Whether it's chipmunks or the humans, the brain is a reconstructive wave embedded in this field, passing through it, is specifying past portions of the change of this field at a particular scale of time. A buzzing fly or a heron-like fly. They can specify the past because the field is transforming indivisibly. There are no instants falling into the past, the non-existence. So the brain is establishing a certain ratio relative to the micro events of the matter field. In the fly's case, the micro events making up the body of the fly, his wing beats, his internal processes. So conceive of our body and the fly side by side within the universal field at the null or infinitely small scale of time. We see there's no spatial differentiation between our body and the fly. Both of these objects, quote unquote, are simply phases, transfers of state within the global transformation of this field, but allow the brain to gradually apply an increasing time scale in its specification. The outlines of the fly begin to emerge. Then, raising the energy state, the shimmering oscillations of its vibrant, organic, crystalline structure. Then changing the energy state some more, he slowly begins to flap his wings, like a heron. And then, raising that, or changing the energy state more, actually lowering it, he becomes the buzzing being of normal scale. Thus, the essential spatial unity of the two within the matter field, our body and the little fly, is never broken. We arrive at Bergson's principle. Subject is differentiating object, differentiating from object not in terms of space, but of time. Or as he put it, questions of subject and object and their distinction and their union must be put in terms of time, not space. So let me slightly modify one of those koans of Zen, this one from the master Usui. From who is it that hears, the koan becomes who is it that sees. The basis of the experiential answer of Zen enlightenment is clear. There is no one that sees. What is being specified at a given scale of time is a time scale modified, perspective-based, action-relevant form of the elementary awareness defined throughout the holographic field. This is Bergson's panpsychism. So back to the panpsychic solution. Again, the panpsychic emergentist guys say they've solved the hard problem. No. A list of things not considered, as usual, enormous. The perception of time-extended events, the scale of time of events, the role of invariance laws defining events, the relation of subject and object. This fundamental question is experience stored in the brain, because since it's not occurring solely within the brain, it can't be stored there. What is explicit memory? What is consciousness? Why is consciousness needed for cognition? Language understanding, analogy, common sense knowledge, all these all play in, as we've discussed. So I think emergentist panpsychism sort of becomes a pumpkin. So Phil represents an increasing awareness of the problems of physics and physicalism, but not of the classic metaphysic beneath it all. Secondly, the standard complete failure to even consider Bergson, who had been there and way beyond, way before these guys. When one looks at this book, the index for starts says much. We're referencing philosophers like Armstrong, Blackburn, Bloch, Luther, Chalmers, Churchland, Dennett, Nagel. In other words, mostly all contemporary philosophers. And then subject index, we have the anti-subject summing argument, a posteriori identity, austerity problem, causal collusion problem, compositional nihilism, conceivability, disposition, etc., etc. So the problem is we're getting a somewhat ingrown philosophical community speaking to themselves as to what they regard as the problems. Phil says he loves neuroscience, follows it closely, but what he and other philosophers and neuroscience guys for that matter also need to love is perception, ecological, Gibson, cognition, Piaget, Wertheimer, Hofstadter, Sander, memory, the whole field of research, theory, where Bergson began his analysis and research for 5 years before writing Matter and Memory. These guys seriously need more constraints on their thought. While absorbing these fields, they should be asking, how in heck can the brain be doing this? Doesn't the theory of consciousness need to be able to cover this too? Just saying, things might change. So next, well, we've already seen, since this is a repeat. So we'll come back some other time.